part two of the first principles. So Bonnie suggested we start going through first principles because we're getting away from them a little bit. So the first one I wanted to do was hell. But then when I started looking into hell, I was like, well, you really need to talk about soul and immortal soul, or it doesn't make sense. There's nothing to go into hell. So today I want to go into the first principles part two, more about hell. But of course, in order to do that, I have to review some of the immortal soul. So some of this will be a review, a repeat of the last one, but luckily it was 2 months ago. So yeah, who's going to remember? So I apologize for that. We'll do a little repeat and then we'll get into hell specifically related to the Bible. So I started, instead of just reading definitions from all the Christian dictionaries and encyclopedias, I pulled up a lovely YouTube short. It's less than a minute, and it describes what hell is. And this is from, I think, the BibleNetwork.com. It's a group of Jewish and Christian people who try to promote Bible reading with correct views from the Bible. So this is their particular video on hell.
What does the Bible really say about hell? In the Bible, hell is depicted as a place of torment, darkness, and separation from God. In the book of Revelation, hell is described as a lake of fire, where the wicked are cast after the final judgment. Jesus himself speaks of hell as a place of weeping and gnashing of teeth, a realm where the soul suffers for eternity. The Bible also portrays hell as a place of outer darkness, far removed from the presence of God, where there is no hope of redemption or escape. It's a sobering reminder of the consequences of a life lived apart from God.
So there's our definition of hell. Not very pleasant. So what we want, if I can hit my buttons correctly. So what we want to do is review the history of the immortal soul again, and I'll try to go through this relatively fast. We've already done that, but I think it's important before we get into this hell damnation. The history of damnation and hell, where does this come from? And of course, as we can guess before we get started, a lot of this comes from Egyptian, pagan, kind of polytheistic religions long before it got into Judaism and Christianity. And then what does the Bible say about this? I mean, we already know because we watched the video, but let's just try to proof that. So Pew Research Center, we talked about this a little bit last time. The last one they did on this was in 2021, where as far as Americans go, about 75% believe we have an immortal soul. So a large majority, and these are people that both confessed they were religious and non-religious. 75% of all people in this study said we have an immortal soul. The interesting thing is little over 70% said the immortal soul is going to heaven, but only 62% thought the immortal soul can go to hell. So there's this discrepancy on what happens with this immortal soul. But they're like, it's looking promising because the people who think the immortal soul can go to hell is up. It's up from 58% in 2014. So it's starting to balance out a little bit. It's kind of an interesting little study there. So anyway, the majority of people do believe in this. It's a very common thing among many different religions, which we talked about last time. I mean, Hinduism, Judaism, Christianity, Catholicism, most popular religions believe in some form of immortal soul or something after we die. So let's look at a quick historical review. I'll try not to go too fast, but I do want to kind of breeze through this. So despite widespread use and belief, as we know, this is nowhere in the Bible. Immortal and soul are not found together anywhere. We have different words for soul, and we have immortal that's presented 6 times, but nowhere in the Bible are these together. So where does this idea come from? And then what is this true meaning of hell that they keep referring to that's mentioned throughout the Bible and pretty much any version of that? So we went into this a little more in depth last time, but the belief in the mortal soul can be traced back to very early pagan religions, thousands of years ago. The Babylonians, the Assyrians, especially the Egyptians, because the Egyptians actually made a really good record. They wrote and carved a lot of things about it. So Herodotus, our father of history of the Greeks, where we get pretty much most of our Assyrian and Babylonian information comes from him, from word of mouth. But he asserts the Egyptians are the first one to really write it down and give us details about this immortal soul. So it starts in these pagan religions, which makes sense. Then it's expanded upon greatly by these Greek influencers, especially Plato. Plato gets a lot of credit. He wrote a lot about this separation of this soul that lasts forever and where does it go. So Plato is really kind of the one that made this concrete into all religious denominations. And then we start getting into the church, and there's a few different people, but most will give St. Augustine of Hippo, the guy that really pushed it. Like, if you don't believe this, you're going to hell. We might kill you. You're going to be excommunicated. I mean, so he's really the one that forced this as a required belief. So as we talk about Herodotus, the father of history, his famous quote is, "My business is to set down that is told me. To believe it is none of my business." So that's why some people call him the father of lies. He says he's just a historian. He's trying to preserve all this word of mouth. And without him, we wouldn't have a lot of the information we do have on Babylonian and Assyrians. Some of it's correct, some of it's not. But one of his writings is about the great Spartans, the 300 Spartans. And Herodotus said, Leonidas, which is the captain of the 300, said, Spartans, tonight we dine in hell. So we find that through Herodotus, which tells us already this concept was already around at that point. Now, whether he was saying this figuratively or whether they really meant it, this kind of terminology and phraseology was already present way back. And of course, the Spartans were polytheistic. You know, they were believing in everything at that point. Then we get to Plato, which we talked about him a little bit, but he's the one that really pushed and wrote a lot about the body and the mortal soul are separate. The soul is shown to be immortal, and since immortal, it's indestructible. So something has to happen to this soul. So that's where the soul is either going to heaven or hell, or as we go on into St. Augustine, there's this purgatory. So we have this in-between thing. But Plato wrote a lot about that and really influenced many people. Now, this History of Christianity is a book, and I got some of it pulled up online. But it's interesting because some of these book authors I pulled up are just Christians who do not believe in immortal soul, and they don't believe in heaven or hell when you die, which is really interesting to me. They're non-denominational Christians, but they write books on it. Not as many books as the people that believe it, but I thought these were pretty interesting. And so in the History of Christianity, multiple authors, they wrote, there was no popular concept, discussion, or practice of an eternal hell among Jews or Christians until roughly 400 years after the death of Christ. So what happened? And they go into all these different things. Now, I would argue this was Paul talked about this, Josephus talked about this, but maybe when they said popular concept, it wasn't so like almost everybody believed it. It was there, but it wasn't the mainstream focus of most of these religious people. And we know that because Paul talks about this. When we look back in Acts, Paul recognized there's sort of these pagan beliefs going along between the Pharisees and Sadducees already in the Bible. So Acts 23:6. But when Paul perceived that one part were Sadducees and the other Pharisees, he cried out in the council, men and brethren, I am a Pharisee, the son of a Pharisee. Of the hope and resurrection of the dead, I am called in question. And when he had said so, there arose a dissension between the Pharisees and Sadducees, and the multitude was divided. For the Sadducees say there is no resurrection, neither angel or spirit, but the Pharisees confess both. So there's already this kind of discussion among the Jews long before 400 years after Christ on this. And Josephus also talks about that. Josephus says the Pharisees say that all souls are incorruptible, but that the souls of good men only are removed from their bodies, and the souls of bad men are subject to eternal punishment. So this was already sneaking in long before 400 years ago. So that's why I thought it was like, well, maybe not mainstream, but I mean, this is in the Bible. So then we got good old St. Augustine. So now we're 400 years past the death of Christ. And he's the one on almost any literature they're really going to give. St. Augustine's the one that pushed this into the modern realm of Christianity, Catholicism. He pushed this hard. And so this is, again, out of the History of Christianity. Since the time of Augustine, Christians have been taught that between death and resurrection, the souls of the dead either go to paradise or they go to hell. The disembodied soul is supposed to continue until the resurrection. So he was like, okay, we know there's a resurrection. At that point, they're like, okay, we read this in the Bible. Christ is going to return and have a resurrection, but we also have this immortal soul. So this immortal soul's got to go somewhere. Makes no sense, but if you're going to believe in the immortal soul, it either goes to heaven or hell. You either have your reward or punishment, and then Christ returns, and then you're back in your body, and then you get judged. So it's hard to even wrap your head to how this would even be sensical. But that's what St. Augustine was kind of pushing, and that's sort of where a lot of this came from. I don't believe Plato or any of those were even talking about the judgment. So he had to take pagan thoughts plus some biblical stuff and kind of incorporate them into one big mix. Now, I used this last time. This is Samuel Dawson. He's a professor of systemic theology. And the book is called The Teaching of Jesus. He's another one that does not believe in this kind of stuff. So he had some interesting quotes I thought I would quote from him. So this is right out of his book. So by far, the main person responsible for making hell eternal in the Western Church was St. Augustine. He was a bishop of Hippo in North Africa. He did not know Greek, had tried to study it, but stated that he hated it. Sadly, it's his misinterpretation of Greek that cemented the concept of eternal hell in the Western Church. St. Augustine not only said that hell was eternal for the wicked, but for anyone who wasn't a Christian. So he's the one that started saying, you're going to get excommunicated, maybe we'll get killed. You have to believe this. You can't read the Bible. You're not allowed to have a printed version of the Bible, but this is the truth. And they also give him credit for being the one who invented purgatory. So purgatory was not even thought about until St. Augustine came about and, started adding in some lovely things. So again, same book. Most of what we believe about hell comes from Catholicism, early Catholicism, and the ignorance of the Old Testament, not from the Bible. And of course, what he didn't mention is all these pagan customs that were already written down. And these are his words. I now believe that hell is the invention of Roman Catholicism, and surprisingly, most, if not all, of our popular concepts of hell can be found in writings like Dante's Inferno and Paradise Lost. And he goes through 2 chapters and describes how when most people do a video or they talk about hell, you can almost point back to these 2 books, among other things. But you got Dante's Inferno, and I had to read both of these in a religious studies class in college, which goes through the different layers of tunneling hell. And depending how bad you are, you have these different punishments. And you can go to YouTube and there'll be these professors of theology talking about these. Like they're out of the Bible. I mean, you're quoting Dante's Inferno. It's hilarious. And then John Milton's Paradise Lost. This is a little bit later on. He was an Englishman, but most of our popular concepts of how when people actually get into detail in describing hell, it comes from poets, pagan poets. So it's pretty interesting that a lot of the details, because there's no details except for fire and brimstone and lake of fire. I mean, there's not that many details, but this is where they come from. So I thought that was just super interesting that at least there are some Christians out there going, hey, this really doesn't make any sense. So we have a few other people that are always brought up, even on a Google search. And the other one's Tertullian. And I can't say I've ever heard of this guy, but he was there. And they say St. Augustine was probably influenced greatly by this Tertullian. He's considered to be the father of Latin Christianity. He's the very first one who translated the Greek and Hebrew into Latin. But there's all kinds of quotes. Supposedly this guy was somewhat crazy. He envisioned hell being filled with every philosopher and theologian who ever argued with him. And this wasn't a joke. This was written many, many times. It's one of those things, if you don't believe what I say, you're going to hell. So it's just amazing. And they write this stuff. So Samuel Dawson from the same book says, his Latin-based Bible became a catalyst for these scores of error-filled translations, even later on in the future. And we would have been better off if they would have skipped this Latin translation altogether, because so many biases and errors were actually brought into these kind of And then we have Celsus. He was a 2nd century Greek philosopher. He was an opponent to Christianity. He thought Christianity was going to start taking over the masses and controls of the kings. So he was very much a pagan or a non-Christian person. But even he writes truthfully that hell was a good way to control the behavior of the unwashed masses, but that no wise man would truly believe in it, because there was no basis for this for people who read the Bible. So though Origen, the interesting thing is his book was called True Doctrine, and they say there's no copies of it anywhere. It got destroyed because the church burnt them all. But Origen did a book called Contra Celsium, where he went through and argued every single point that Celsus made. And they said you can reproduce this true doctrine completely just from Origen's trying to fight it off. So you kind of know what he wrote. But it was just kind of interesting that he wrote that. Yeah. Okay, so what does the Bible say about immortal soul? And this is kind of a review of the last one we did. So nowhere is immortal and soul together in the Bible. We've got 2 primary words. One's nephesh, which is the Hebrew word. And again, it means a living, breathing creature, person, or even animal. And then suke is the Greek versions. And it's listed multiple times, over 750 times in the Old Testament, and in Greek over 106 times. So we'll just go through a few examples again on these. Oh, well, then immortal. So we've got soul, nephesh or suke, and we got immortal, athanasia, aphartos. Those are the 2 words that are translated immortal. They're only found 6 times in the New Testament. 3 times they're referring to the final judgment. For this, corruption must put on incorruption. This mortal must put on immortality. And the other 3 times it only refers to God. Now to the King eternal, immortal, invisible. So that's it. It's never occurring with soul, and it's only 6 times, 3 referring to the final judgment, 3 referring to God. So to put those together is not biblical whatsoever. So let's look at some examples of this suke or nephesh. So Genesis 2:7, and a man became a living soul. So we know a soul can be created, because a soul is what a man is. It's not something he has. He is a living soul. Genesis 46, those barren to Jacob, even 16, souls. So we know a soul can be born. We're looking at, and there's thousands of examples, there's 750 examples, but Exodus 12, for whosoever eateth leavened bread shall be cut off from the first day into the 7th day, and that soul or nephesh shall be cut off from Israel. So a soul can eat. So this immortal, quote unquote, soul can be created, is born, can eat. Doesn't seem to follow a pattern. Souls can die. Just the classic verses from Ecclesiastes. For that which befalleth the sons of men befalleth beasts. Even one thing befalleth them. As one dies, so dieth the other. Yea, they all have one breath, so that a man has no preeminence over a beast, for all is vanity. All go into one place, all are of dust, and all turn to dust again. So you can be born, you can die, you can eat. It also applies to animals. So if we're going to carry this through, which already we can't because it doesn't make sense, animals also have immortal souls that go to purgatory, heaven, or hell. And God created great whales and every living creature, and that was nephesh, that moveth, that swims, every winged fowl. And basically, if we go to Genesis 1:30, every beast of the earth where there is life or nephesh. So a little bit of Bible study, and this thing's already not even worth talking about anymore, but it's interesting because there's still the majority of people believe in this. What are the faithful? I think this is a huge one. When we talk of the faithful chapter, all these faithful people that haven't yet received the promises. So the Faith Hall of Fame in Hebrews 11, all these died not having received the promises, but having seen them afar off. For no man hath ascended to heaven. So we have plenty of verses. Sepulchre is still with him. That obviously they haven't received the promises. They're not in heaven or hell, and they haven't received the judgment yet. All right. So that was our moral soul review. So now we don't need to talk about hell because there is no immortal soul, but we'll do it anyway because that's still. So what does the Bible say about hell? Because there is quite a few verses that talk about hell, and they come from a few different words. So the main words we're going to look at, what words are interpreted hell in the Bible? Well, the Sheol means the grave, and that's Hebrew, and that's going to be found in the Old Testament. Hades, which is interesting because that's the Greek, but that also is the Greek god of, the underworld. So it's kind of interesting to use that particular word. And then Gehenna is used quite a few times, and that's literally a physical place that's used kind of as a metaphor, let's say. So if you condemn somebody to hell or Hades, it was simply say they would die. And so Sheol means the grave, Hades means the grave, and Gehenna is a specific place. So we're going to look at all these. And there's Tertullian. There's one other word that's used only one time, but it's a similar type of similar definition. So Old Testament, the Hebrew word is Sheol, Strong's 787585. So it really means place of the dead, the grave, the pit, or if you want to use the word hell as a translation. But if you use place of the dead, the grave, or the pit in any of these, it actually makes sense. You'll find they have to be very selective where they choose to use hell in some of these verses. So you can see there's a big bias on how they're using these words. And so I use King James as my standard in all these. I look these up, but it occurs 65 times in the Old Testament. It's pretty much equally split between grave and hell, 31 each, and then 3 times it's the pit. So we'll look at a couple examples of these where Sheol is first, can only mean the grave. So they put it as the grave. It'd make a lot more sense. So Genesis 37:35, this is about Jacob. And all his sons and his daughters rose up to comfort him, but he refused to be comforted, for he said, I will go down into Sheol, the grave, until my son mourning. Thus his father wept for him when he thought Joseph was dead. So what makes sense? He's going down to hell. Why would he go down to hell? Because he's upset by this. And then we move on. Poor Jacob again. Genesis 42. I think this is when Joseph put the silver in Benjamin's sack. And he said, my son shall not go down with you, for his brother is dead, and he is left alone. If mischief befall him by the way in which he go, then ye shall bring down my gray hairs with sorrow to the grave. So that makes sense. He's talking about dying. This is going to kill him. It wouldn't make sense to put hell in there. We have a few others. The Lord killeth and maketh alive. He bringeth us down to the grave and bringeth up. And I don't have to read all these, but all these are going to be where Sheol clearly is going to mean grave. It's interesting because if we look at Job, they'll bounce back and forth between grave and hell, depending on which one seems to fit better. So Job 14, when he's going through all the trials, oh, that would hideth me in the grave, that would have kept me secret until thy wrath be past, and thou wouldst appoint me a set time and remember me. So here we're saying grave, and then we'll go to chapter 11, a few chapters before that. It is high as heaven, that what canst thou do deeper than hell? What canst thou, so in that case, that would be a really nice way to transfer this as hell. He must be talking about this eternal. So it's just kind of interesting that how they chose, and it's different in each version, but even with King James, half of these, they're like, well, hell will fit a little bit better than all these. Ezekiel, Isaiah, where they're kind of prophesying against Egypt and Babylon, and the curses that are going to come to them. Of course, those curses are going to be, they're all going to go down straight down to hell. And even David's interpretation in Psalms, the wicked shall be turned to hell. But we could take every single one of these, and grave or pit would make perfect sense. Where hell doesn't, they happen to put grave. This is another book. It's Pagan Christianity. A couple guys, non-denominational Christians, but they don't believe in this stuff. And so it's kind of fun to read non-Christadelphian people that have very similar viewpoints that this just doesn't make sense. If you guys actually studied your Bible, it doesn't make sense. So this is a quote out of this book. Nothing like eternal lake of fire of hell was even remotely suggested to Adam, Eve, Cain, Abel, Noah, Abraham, Lot, Job, Moses, David, Solomon, Daniel. In fact, this concept was never even mentioned to the worst offenders in the Bible. There are also no Old Testament warnings about the need to repent in order to avoid suffering, either eternal or temporary after death. So it's kind of interesting. They're like, this is all pagan. And he pretty much the same thing as Samuel Dawson. They're like, you guys aren't getting this from the Bible whatsoever. This is all Greek and Egyptian mythology that we're believing and trying to interpret it through just very selective verses. So that was Sheol. That was Old Testament, where the majority of these are really coming from. And then we take a similar word, or the Greek word is Hades. It's going to mean the same thing as far as definition. Place of the dead, the grave, the pit, or hell. This one's only occurring 11 times in the New Testament. So 11 times total. That's it for Hades. It's interpreted hell 1 time or 10 times and grave once. And this is in the King James Version. The Authorized Standard Version, I believe, is the same. So this is an eyesore, but I wanted to put them up there because it's only 11 verses. And so these are the 11 verses of Hades. And of course, the only verse where they put grave is 1 Corinthians 15:55. Oh, death, where's your sting? Oh, hell, where's your victory? They're like, that wouldn't make much sense. So let's go ahead and put grave in this one. But, so I thought this was interesting because on the Revised, the King James Plus, almost all of them, this will be the one verse where they'll put grave, not hell. But then I went into some Bible commentaries to see how they justify it. So this got fun. So there was a bunch of them, but these are my favorite too. So what do they say about this verse, and why are they comfortable, doing this verse as grave instead of hell? So these are the two. They were all great, but these are the two I picked out. So Barnes notes on the Bible, "O grave, Hades, the place of the dead, it is not improperly rendered. The word properly denotes a place of darkness, then the world or abodes of the dead. According to Hebrews, Hades or Sheol was a vast subterranean receptacle or abode where the souls of the dead existed. It was dark, deep, still, awful. The descent to it was through the grave, and the spirits of all the dead were supposed to be assembled there." So they're still justifying it. We could have put hell, but we didn't want to confuse you guys, And then Cambridge Bible for colleges, literally all of them pretty much have something like this. "O grave, where is our victory?" In the Greek, "O Hades," the Vulgate, which is followed by Tyndale, read death here for Hades. So do Irenaeus and Tertullian. So there's the Tertullian guy writing in the 2nd century. But the ancient Syriac version reads Hades. Bishop Wordsworth suggests that the text was altered from a fear lest the passage should give any countenance to the idea of a god of the shades below, known to the Greeks by the name of Hades. So we don't want to confuse people that, this Hades or devil will be there. But in later Greek and in the Septuagint, its use to denominate the place of departed spirits was well established. So you read all these, they're just justifying. We put grave, but you know what we mean. It's ridiculous. So we got Sheol, we got Hades, but then we have this different word, Gehenna. Gehenna is literally a location. This doesn't necessarily mean the grave or the pit. This is a place. So the Hebrew word Gehinnom, or the Valley of Hinnom, is the origin of the Greek word Gehenna. And because this is in the New Testament, we're pretty much reading Gehenna when Christ talks about this. So the Valley of Ben Hinnom, also known as Gehenna in the Greek, is a historical and geographical valley in Jerusalem. And there's a few different verses that actually describe this Valley of Gehenna. One of them I pulled up here is Joshua 15, verse 8. And it's kind of just talking about the borders. "And the border went up by the valley of the son of Hinnom and to the south side of the Jebusite, the same as Jerusalem. And the border went up towards the top of the mountain that lieth before the valley of Hinnom westward, which is at the end of the valley of the giants northward." And you can look on current maps and they still will call this Ben Hinnom Valley. So originally, I didn't give credit. I should give credit. I just found this on the internet. But they say in 1st century Jerusalem, we kind of have the smaller walled city. Then this valley between the mountains was the Valley of Hinnom. And so that was just the name it was given, but then bad things took place there. So it started being talked about even more and more. So what happened in this Valley of Hinnom, this physical location? Well, here's another picture, actually. This is more recent. So if you see, you got Mount Moriah and Mount of Olives, and then between where those come together, you have the Ben Hinnom Valley, which they call it today, in the Hebrew. And this is supposed to be a view of the Ben Hinnom Valley on the right, looking from the Mount of Olives. So now, of course, it's all built up, but back in the day, this would have been kind of a ravine between the mountains. So there's some descriptions of Gehenna, or the Valley of Hinnom. Some bad things were happening there in the Bible. The two kings around Hezekiah, which I found very interesting, we talk about this specifically. So 2 Chronicles 28 and 2 Chronicles 33. So the first one's Ahaz. So, and I'll just read this here. Ahaz was 20 years old when he began to reign, and he reigned 16 years in Jerusalem. But he did not that which was right in the sight of the Lord, like David his father. For he walked in the ways of the kings of Israel and made molten images for Balaam. Moreover, he burned incense in the valley of the son of Hinnom, and burnt his children in the fire after the abomination of the heathen, whom the Lord hath cast out before the children of Israel. So here we got all kinds of pagan, idolatrous things taking place in this particular valley. And then we get Manasseh after Hezekiah. I think that's right. Ahaz, Hezekiah. So we get a good king, and then here we go right after a good king. Same thing happens. So then he, referring to Manasseh in 33, builds altars for all the hosts of heaven in the two courts in the house of the Lord. And he caused his children to pass through the fire in the valley of the son of Hinnom. He also observed times and used enchantments and used witchcrafts and dealt with familiar spirit. And with wizards, he wrought much evil in the sight of the Lord to provoke him to anger. So there was child sacrifices, incense burning, all kinds of heathen pagan customs taking place in this valley through multiple kings. So then we, of course, have Jeremiah's prophecy, and we have King Josiah taking care of this problem. So Jeremiah is talking about this in Jeremiah 7, and they have built the high places of Tophet. And Tophet supposedly was just a city within the valley. It was a city within that valley area. And they had built high places, and they have built the high places of Tophet, which is in the valley of the son of Hinnom, to burn their sons and their daughters in the fire, which I have commanded them not, neither came it into my heart. Therefore, behold, the days come, saith the Lord, that it will no longer be called Tophet, nor the valley of the son of Hinnom, but the valley of slaughter. For they will bury it, and there will be no more place. So this place has been cursed because of all the, horrible things that they were doing in this particular valley. And then King Josiah is the king that really took care of this. He reformed it. He ended all the child sacrifice and all the incense burning and everything there, and he transferred it into a garbage dump, which they said was always consistently just burning. It was just a place of burning garbage from that point on because it's been cursed. So Jerusalem's Hinnom Valley, or this Gehenna, became a perpetual burning garbage dump and city sewer. So the Valley of Gehenna transformed from a physical location to a symbol. So this is more of a symbol of divine punishment. So this would make sense now when we look at some of the verses where Christ is talking about. The people can relate to this, and they know what this valley means. It's a lot more pertinent to them because they're living in the times they're seeing what's going on are slightly past the times. And so Gehenna, so we had Hades only 11 times in the Bible. Gehenna is only 12 times in the Bible. And every time except for James, so 11 of the 12 times, it's Christ talking. And Christ is using this, I think, as a symbol or as a metaphor that they can relate to, this burning pile of garbage, this place that's a wasteland now because it was there's such pagan rituals taking place there. They've leveled it. And so some of the verses, I just highlighted. For example, from Matthew 5, and if thy right eye offend thee, pluck it out and cast it from thee, for it is profitable thee that one of the members should perish, and that the whole body should be cast into hell. And they would relate this, cast into Gehenna, this burning fire pit here. I mean, I think this would make sense to the people at the time. So that's why Christ probably uses this a lot. It's relatable. And fear not them which kill the body, but are not able to kill the soul, but rather fear them that's able to destroy both the body and the soul in hell. So I think as we go through all these different things, I think this would make a lot of sense. And why is it that Christ is mostly the one using this for his descriptions? So as a review, we have two words for the grave. They both pretty much mean the grave. You can take all these verses, you can put grave or pit, and it would make a lot more sense than hell would. And where hell doesn't make sense, they don't use it. So Sheol is Hebrew, Hades is Greek, and the Gehenna was this metaphor from this physical location that was used for a symbol of punishment. And so this is a very similar conclusion that we have with the immortal soul, but I think it's still relative with this. So only through Christ at the judgment do we get immortality. Our soul is just, we're a living, breathing creature. So are animals, even the Hebrews chapter 11, the people are told they've died and they have not yet received the promises. We all have to appear before the judgment seat of Christ, and that's where we're going to receive our, reward or punishment in that case. And the punishment would just be the death. We're not going to burn forever in hellfire. That comes from English poets, pretty much. For as in Adam all die, so in Christ shall all be made alive. To them by patient continuance, seek for immortality. In Romans, we're seeking for it. We're not giving it. We're not trying to decide which way are immortal. So our goal is to seek for immortality. And And this is the same conclusion I used last time, but I think it sums it up really well. So the Bible informs us that man is a mortal soul. He's able to die, and that to die is to sleep the sleep of death until the judgment and Christ returns. The Bible repeatedly compares death to sleep and not conscious existence, a sleep from which we must be awakened in a future resurrection. Plenty of, verses on that. Scripture explicitly states that the dead know nothing. It further assures that there is no knowledge or wisdom in the grave where you're going, or the Sheol or the Hades. That is all. That is my fast rendition. And then the next one, if we do one more of these, go into the devil or Lucifer or Beelzebub, where people can easily translate that into, not easily, but this fallen angel concept, all these different complete concepts that they bring into the devil. Like you can read, Lucifer in Isaiah, and it's like, well, clearly you're talking about the king of Babylon. It even says that later on, but oh no, it's the devil. But this is good to know, because if we're talking to people that really truly believe this, can we get to some verses and put together a logical argument and be like, well, where in the Bible are you getting this information from? These layers of hell is not in the Bible. This is Dante's Inferno. So I think it's good, even though this is kind of basic stuff, still review and refresh and kind of have some of these verses readily available for people that are really, believe this strongly. All right, thank you.